So let's talk about tires. I think these are a great subject for overlays because they're really hard to draw, but if you have control of your overlays, they become not such a big deal. Just like before, I started with a piece of reference that I knew would be useful. And this is especially useful because it's got almost grayscale to begin with, and that's pretty handy. So I cut it out, and this is what I was left with. It's important to notice though, when you look at this, it's not uniformly lit. And remember how I said it's important to be able to take the perspective out of an image? Well, the same is true for value. If you can take lighting out of a photo, it then gives you complete control when you're going to use it in your own illustration. We can see here it's a little darker at the bottom, darker at the top. I kind of want the whole thing to look like this center bit. So with a little bit of adjustment, that's what I ended up with. This is a very uniform, almost like lit in a photo studio kind of a lighting, which I then bring back into my image. So I make a group, which I call tires, which is within the details group. And I put a mask on the whole thing. Now, if you got the bundle, the next hour is all about making masks and edge control. So we'll get there eventually. But having this mask is just going to kind of keep everything in check. So there's a mask on the entire group. Then I need to bring the photo into the correct perspective. And here's where the warp tool becomes so useful. So within Free Transform, you can right click and do warp. And then you have a lattice to shift around parts of the photo here. I've already set this up so, with that one carefully processed photo, I now have 4 tires and they're all in slightly different perspective. Know that getting good at the warp tool is extremely useful. But so we get them in the right perspective, but obviously there's a lot that doesn't match the image. Now in this case, I could have done an overlay blending mode, just like I've done with the camo and the bolts, but I think this is a really good opportunity for an opaque detail. So in that scenario, what I do is I look at the values that I painted in for my underdrawing as kind of a guide. So you'll notice I have a kind of a dark brown for the shadow and this medium brown for the highlight. Well, what that helps me with is that with those contained in a single group, I can use a gradient map adjustment to change what was black and white into the right shades of brown. And you can see that here. It's just a gradient with 2 colors on it, and I got those colors straight out of my underpainting. What was a photographic detail now lives much better within the color palette of my painting. But if you're looking closely, you'll see that there's something missing, which is in the original, they've got these cast shadows. Well, so what I did with that is to control it with another curves adjustment. So I would just go in here and select where the shadows are, just like this. And then I'd take that selection and make another curves adjustment. And here's what I came up with. So the shadows are their own adjustment layer. You can see by changing this curve here, I can decide just how much the shadows are. If I really wanted to, I could change the color, make them really red. As it happens, I don't want to. I really only want to pull down the highlights to make them darker. Now, what's really nice about this is I can go in here and change the contour of the shadow just by changing the mask. Now here I'm painting in the curve adjustment layer in the mask, and I'm painting with white, so I'm adding to the mask. Or I can paint with black and I can remove from the mask. And this just means I can get the little individual bumps of those tire treads. I'm just painting where I want the shadow to be. I might also paint with a big soft airbrush just to kind of have a darker shadow at the bottom here, or maybe if I've gone too far, I can pull it back with black. So when painting in the mask, I'm just saying, where is the change? And then if I want to say, what is the change? Well, that's just the adjustment layer itself. So with a single layer here, you can completely change the lighting. And that applies to the entire group of all these tires. So if I had another tire, it would also get the same changes because, as we've seen a number of times now, by keeping similar elements in a group together, we can control all of them at the same time with adjustment layers. So let's walk that back just so you can see the whole process. It started with individual photo elements getting warped into perspective with the warp tool. I then used a gradient map to get them in kind of the right zone with colors. And then I added lighting with a curves adjustment layer. So it's all non-destructive. I could change either the original photos or I could tweak these adjustment layers, and I don't have to do any manual painting. Okay, so let's bring some of these back again. We had locker doors. Now ladders, turn those on. This is just totally manually painted. You don't always have to use a photographic element. I had a hard time finding ladders that kind of matched the design I was going for, so I just painted them in. Really, as long as you get the value and the colors matching the rest of your image, you can mix and match between hand-painted elements and photographic elements, and they'll all work really well together. In fact, another hand-painted element I made was this group of armor plating. So let's take a look at how I made those. These are going to start looking like familiar techniques. Okay, so roll it back to the beginning. I started with a single hand-painted element. I just made one of these units, and then I duplicated it and free transformed it a bunch of times to get the perspective right. So I sort of went from one base unit, cloned, and ended up through a little bit of masking with just black and white bits of armor. My next step then was, you guessed it, a curve adjustment layer to change the lighting. Here you can see it's all uniform and really doesn't respect the lighting in the scene at all. Well, then I just darkened down certain faces with curves. So you can see I can change how much it is. It's all non-destructive. But obviously the color is still not quite right. So in this case, just like with the tires, I did a color gradient. Here it's, as you can see, just two colors pulled straight from my image. And between these two adjustment layers, color and light, I can take a hand-painted element, which really doesn't match the image at all, and then quickly really pull it into the right world of colors without any manual brush strokes. And because I made it this way, at any point I can change it. So maybe I want these to actually stand out a little more. And I could change this to be a totally different color. And for design reasons, this might be a better choice. Now, in my example here, I'm going to leave it what it was, a little lower impact. But you can see how working with adjustment layers instead of manual brushstrokes just gives you all these extra options. Now, I've run out of time to show each and every element of detail here, but they really all kind of follow this same format. I've been especially rigorous in keeping each of these in their own little subgroup and naming everything. And to be honest, I don't always work quite so neat. But you can see how you really are benefited by keeping it kind of orderly and individually isolated. You really get so much power at the end of the process. But I think all this shows that there's no single way to add overlay details to your image. Over time, once you master these tools, you're going to start to kind of think about your end result and immediately start breaking it down into what might be a good use of a blending mode, and where I would have sort of a general overlay. Or what might make a little more sense to do opaque details, little bits of photo texture you kind of integrate into the image by, changing their colors and changing their values. Or maybe something that's a little bit of both, where you have an opaque overall layer, but with little bits cut out so you can see the underlying form straight through the holes. Because ultimately you're going to be mixing them. This is the sort of thing that you'll be able to do when mastering these overlay techniques, is to go from a basic render where you've firmly established light, shadow, and color, and then make it a little more interesting. It is important that you're good at the basic rendering stuff. This is an absolute must, and it's a prerequisite. But I hope I've shown that there's a lot of different ways for Photoshop to have tight control over overlays. And once you learn this stuff, you are going to be adding detail like you never could before. But it doesn't stop here. If you get the rest of the collection, we're going to talk about all sorts of other avenues to improve your technical overlay chops. And I have to say, thank you so much for buying this series. It's a huge help, and I really appreciate it. So I hope you stick with me, and I'll see you in the next video.